we just need some death and like terrible things to happen, or we're not like we're Roman empires. Like, show us more blood. This is boring. It's just words.
Boy, do I like the term biosolids. That's a euphemism of the first degree.
Indeed. I mean, it is recycled shit.
Yeah. But biosolid is like, you kind of know what it is that's being talked about. It's like it's a very tasteful euphemism. Like, it doesn't feel like a euphemism where you're like, yeah, okay, you're making this pretty. Like, biosolid is just a nicer term for like, yeah, what you just said, like recycled human feces.
Right. And, if it's done properly, it should be completely healthy. Mm-hmm. Unless like everybody in that town is taking like pregnant mare urine or something like that, which could lead to some. Apparently, one issue is that prescription drugs might not leach out as quickly as you would hope.
That makes sense. That's why we're all cautioned to please do not dump your leftover prescription drugs in the toilet.
That's right.
Got it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, most cities that have not good municipal biosolid recycling programs will sort of recommend that you use it for your landscaping as opposed to your vegetable gardening.
For a second, I was like, use my leftover prescription pills for landscaping? Like, what is this? Are we like gingerbread housing my garden? Like studding it with little pills of fluoxetine?
Shall we get into the comforting, less fraught world of murder, intrigue, betrayal, and squid rape?
I was going to say, is it... I don't think anything about this book is comfortable.
No.
But I can't stop turning the pages also. I think I'm sure we'll get into this, but like from the get-go... I am, as much as I admire the ambition of the sellout, and I admire the project and how successful I think he was given the ambition of the project, I think this book is managing a lot of those same things with a much better handle on narrative.
There's a more, I would even argue that the sellout might not even have what I would call a plot.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of gestures at plot.
Yeah.
This book has a kind of naturalistic story that it is telling, although I would still say that it is on the kind of mini plot scale of things. And I don't think you go to this book for the plot.
No.
But maybe we should start with the plot.
Sure.
And do our plot.
Let's go for the plot.
Yeah.
We very quickly discover that we are in an epistolary novel. Like, this is a confession that is being written to the commandant. Our narrator is staying in a, quote, hotel that we then quickly discover is a prison. And then we begin the process. There is a lot of jumping around in time in this book, and you did a really nice job of sort of separating out the kind of like what you say is the nominal plot, and then there's a few kind of overarching plots that we also learn about as we go. A lot of the next, you pointed this out in one of our back and forths, that like the book does take a while to get going. Like, we experience a lot of just right before the fall of Saigon in 1975, at the end of the Vietnam War. We begin in Vietnam. And our narrator is a communist sympathizer who is a aide-de-camp to a Vietnamese general. And most of the action of the first few chapters are about getting the narrator and some of the general staff out of Saigon.
While kind of orienting us to his time and place in relationship to it, too. And when you say he's a sympathizer and a Vietnamese general, particularly it's a South Vietnamese general, so he is essentially a spy or a traitor. he's a plant. He's a mole, and he's passing information to his friend Nan, who is also a North Vietnamese spy master, basically. And so, yeah, we're in this sort of Saigon place. What's interesting is that he likes the general he's working for. He also gets his friend Bon. Am I saying his name right?
Yeah, we got
his friend Bon.
And then Man is his
Man,
other friend.
sorry.
Yeah, those three kind of
Nan,
grew up all together. And our narrator and Man become communists. And Bon is... I mean, I don't think capitalist is the right word in this particular setting, but is more sympathetic
South
to the Vietnamese
patriot.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
South Vietnamese patriot.
Right, and not fond of the communists. And, this is a situation, too, where this war has been ongoing for so long. All of the sides have reason to be angry because atrocities have been committed by both sides in this conflict, too. So there are grudges, there's jealousy. We're in the midst of a dirty, ugly, colonialistic puppet war. And our narrator, I don't think we ever get his name. The first thing he tells us is that he can see things from both sides. And he, he's on the communist side, but he's embedded with the South Vietnamese, the same side that the United States is on. And he has friends, and he has genuine regard for the people who he is spying on as well. And he describes this, you don't, he rarely mentions the commandant after the first chapter. It comes up from time to time. After that, it just sort of feels like you're in a first person novel, although he is very introspective, and from time to time he does directly address the commandant. So, after some bribing and some harrowing moments, they escape Saigon, and eventually the general and our narrator end up in Los Angeles. Our narrator had been a student at Occidental College, which is in Eagle Rock. Fascinatingly enough, when I was reading this, I was staying in Eagle Rock,
cool.
like a mile away from his campus, which is a thing that's happened a few times. Excuse me. And so the general basically starts beginning this kind of, government revolution in exile. Him and all of his kind of various followers, like officers, find kind of things to do economically in the United States, like running a laundry, running a Vietnamese restaurant. Actually, there's this kind of interesting flashback to the Vietnamese restaurant scenes in Neil Stephenson's Zodiac, too, which you're like... Because I feel like Neil Stephenson's character even sort of had some observation that, like, oh yeah, these people were like fighting a war 15 years ago, and now they're cooking me delicious food.
Yeah.
And then our narrator is also he gets a job at Occidental College. He starts an affair with Sophia Mori, or Ms. Mori, who I forget. She's another employee of the department chair, is that right? I can't quite remember exactly.
She's kind of
and
the
then that sort
administrative
of
assistant to the department chair, and sort of dislikes the department chair just as much as the narrator does, because the department chair is pretty awful,
pretty Orientalist. There's the actual motto of Occidental College is something like Occident Proxima. Basically, the East is nearest the West. There seems to be this interesting fascination in fetishizing of Asia and Asians. And I should also say our narrator is Eurasian. His father, I believe, was French, a French missionary priest. And so he's often referred to as a bastard, which in the Vietnamese context doesn't just mean that his parents weren't married, but also seems to be particularly used for kind of mixed racial people like him too. And then, at some point we get to our kind of real moral test of the first half of the book. And I'll hand it back to you with the section I'm calling The Killing of the Crapulent Major.
and crapulent in this particular case is our author just could not help himself moment. We've seen a few.
No, I don't believe the character is ever referred to anything from the moment he's introduced. he is only referred to as the crapulent major.
Yeah.
And probably at least 100 times in the course of the book.
And our poor crapulent major is a heavier gentleman whom our narrator had actually saved. The narrator was given the ability to pick a small number of the general's men that would actually be able to escape Saigon. The crapulent major is one of them. The general starts realizing that there is a mole, that there is a sympathizer in their midst. And of course, our narrator, realizing that it's him, offers up the crapulent major as sacrifice, basically, kind of fingers him as the mole. And the general says, this was your fault, and I want you to get rid of him. And the narrator and Bon loses his wife and his son during the escape from Saigon, which I think is an important part. I've got a reading about that later.
Actually, I wonder if we have the same one.
I bet we do. I wonder if we do. It really, and if we do, I've got a few other ones too. But
I have another one as well. But
I think it's unsurprising that we picked that. It really feels like an important part of the first third of the book. The narrator has quite a lot of quibbles about killing the crapulent major, but kind of realizes that he's gotten himself into an irreversible situation. And he and Bon do pull off an assassination of the major. They make it look like a robbery. And to kind of not directly assuage his guilt, our narrator finds himself as a consultant to a Francis Ford Coppola, Stanley Kubrick esque,
maybe a little Oliver Stone.
Yeah, tossed in there.
Like, to me, it's those three kind of combined together with maybe like a little more assholishness than any of those three actually necessarily embodied.
Yeah, if you like took those three and like threw in Colonel Kurtz as played by Marlon Brando, you would kind of get the auteur.
Right.
But our narrator somehow finds himself kind of consulting on the auteur's script for a movie about Vietnam, and I will kick it back over to you. And we will return to a setting from one of our earlier books.
Right, we're in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, the movie plot-wise is very different from Apocalypse Now, but the filming is very similar to kind of the legendarily arduous filming of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, there's like some Cecil DeMille in there too. Like the scope of the movie is quite over the top.
And this really did happen, too, with Francis Coppola. You know, they had all sorts of problems. It was incredibly difficult to film. There's a whole documentary about it. Also kind of reminds, there's the documentary about Fitzcarraldo, and Werner Herzog filming that film, which has a kind of similar element, you know, single-minded director, tropical setting, people getting sick, people getting hurt. The relationship between the narrator and the director, the auteur, sours. Because, you know, the narrator doesn't pull his punches and is really pointing out that the movie is very much being told about Vietnam, but the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese setting really just serve as a prop for the narrator to kind of explore some of his own ideas about humanity, which I would say is kind of a fair criticism of Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket. Maybe not Born on the 4th of July, which I think might be maybe a little bit more, I don't know. I actually, maybe Born on the 4th of July and Platoon. All of these films are really about Americans, white Americans, and kind of the moral hazard of getting involved. And so to the degree to which Vietnamese characters appear, they are tragic, or they are evil, or they are innocent and are harmed. They are all sort of being reacted to by the white American characters. Our narrator is pointing this out, and the auteur is not happy about it, so their relationship sours. But he does take the auteur takes some of the narrator's advice in terms of making some of the Vietnamese characters more believable, authentic, more fully formed characters. And then towards the end of the filming, there's going to be a scene in which a cemetery is bombed or blown up, and the narrator visits it, partly because his parents' names, I believe, are on the fake gravestones, but the explosions go off too early, which he suspects maybe isn't an accident. Maybe this is the auteur trying to kill him. He ends up in the hospital. He survives. And then he is basically bought off by the auteur and the insurance company for, I think it's like, it ends up being, $10,000 or $15,000 or something like that, which was probably a pretty good sum of money back then. This is the 1970s. And then he gives half of it to the widow of the crapulent major, again, to assuage his guilt for killing this man who was completely innocent of what he was killed for.
And our narrator has plenty of moral failings, but he's also a pretty nice guy.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think he has a lot of moral failings, but he is not morally, he doesn't deceive himself morally. In fact, the reading that maybe we both pulled kind of speaks to this. The reading I pulled, that because he knows what side he's on, but because he's able to relate to people on all sides of this conflict, and he is friends with somebody on the side that he's against, and he admires the general who he's working for, even as he's betraying him, and he even kind of admires the auteur filmmaker, even as he finds him insufferable and terrible. Because of that, he can't really delude himself about the murder that he commits and the spying that he's doing. Later in a flashback scene, we also learn that in order to gain trust from the South Vietnamese, he studied torture and not really torture, but he studied interrogation under his friend, who he genuinely likes, this man who's Claude, who's part of the CIA, and as such employs a pretty horrendous tactic in order to get a forced confession from one of his comrades, a communist Vietnamese who's been captured. And so he's doing many, many morally compromised things, and he feels bad about it. And he also is pretty honest and thoughtful about the moral problems with how he's behaving, and he's not able to kind of wrap his moral behavior in the kind of justifications that some warriors and freedom fighters and spies are able to do.
Yeah, he manages this very odd kind of double vision of remaining committed to the cause of communism and Marxism and doing plenty of very bad things in service of that goal, but also a lot of very humane things. He's a very complicated guy. And I think one of the virtues of this book is that the complexity feels accurate. It doesn't feel inaccurate to me. It really does feel like the moral quandaries of somebody who has really gone for the moonshot of moral complexity.
Yeah, well, and I think that his point of view, I agree. I think it feels honest. I think it's the best thing about the book is the clarity of the narrator with regard to his moral culpability. And I think that he also basically sees everybody, or at least all the people that he's describing, the general, his two friends, Bond and Mann, the crapulent major, the congressman, some of these other people as kind of similarly deeply morally compromised in the same way that he is. And he doesn't necessarily judge them or despise them for it. It's as though everyone's sort of trapped in the same amber to some degree. And he's describing the amber. Yeah. And he's a sympathizer. He's sympathetic to everybody, even though he has chosen his side. And I think that's done really well. I think that's the part of the book that I like the most.
Well, I think we should jump into your questions right from that, where you just talked about the fact that he is a sympathizer. So talk to me about your first question here.
Well, I'll give you a little context here too, which is I'm rereading Dune, and partly because I feel like I'm going to go see the new movies. I have not seen part one. I've texted about this a little bit. Maybe one day I'll talk about more about why I was reluctant to see both of these movies, but I've decided I'm probably going to see them. And so I wanted to have one more turn with the book before the images of these film replaces the images that my brain has created. And also just I think as much as sometimes it's good to go to the movie first, I've read that book 3 or 4 times, and I think just reading it one more time, I'll enjoy the movies more. And so in that book is also about intrigue and espionage and people moving from one place to another place and not being sure of who there are a lot of similarities to the plot of the Sympathizer.
Colonialism,
but
compromise,
sort of trying to be moral within a kind of immoral context, within the context of war, in which treachery, murder, and deceit are kind of part of the game. All of these things. But the thing that's really, really different about Dune is that there's some very, very clear bad guys. Yeah. And that's really useful from a storytelling point of view, because you never wonder what side you're on while you're reading Dune. Yeah. There's one character who is very interesting, Dr. Yue, the traitor. Yep. And he's a little more sympathetic, but he's a victim of the bad guys. Yep. And the bad guys are bad. And that can be really useful when you're telling a war story. And this book doesn't have that. And instead, our narrator sympathizes with everybody. Yeah. And I'm curious what you think that gets you and what you think that loses you.
Whoa, that's a big question. That's a good question, though. Okay, so I think there's so much doubling that happens in this book. So much of the visual imagery we get is about doubled images or double entendres, things that can mean different stuff in the same setting. Is read about blood, is read about communism, is read about money, is right. read about passion. There's a lot of what this book is doing is kind of like flipping various images in front of your face over and over again, where it might be like South Vietnamese good, North Vietnamese good, general good. I mean, like a lot of the characters in here are simply given titles that are stripped of identity. So so the general's wife is just Madame.
And the auteur, the crapulent major, like the department head.
And I think one of the things that the author is trying to do is play around with our concepts of what is positive and what is negative. And I think that's a really admirable attempt, because some of the movies that you've just talked about, in one direction, you can be like, these are good movies. And the other direction, you can say, well, like you had just said, a lot of the characters in here that are not white are kind of portrayed in ways that are not accurate and not helpful. And a lot of the media that we as Americans consume about things like wars that our country has prosecuted is fairly biased. And I think by creating this character who is a sympathizer, who sympathizes with everybody, he's both a communist sympathizer and just a sympathetic person.
Yep.
By doing that, when the author really manages to deeply complicate the nature of war and conflict and art making and really like any of the choices that you make in life. I don't have it queued up, but I might find it if you and I have the same reading. There is an absolutely hilarious section when they're shooting the movie, when there's a bunch of Vietnamese extras who don't want to play the Viet Cong, and then they get a raise, so they're willing to play Viet Cong. It's very, very, very funny, and manages to be a good scene and tell us something about the nature of identity and the nature of picking sides, which I
the director wants them to act particularly brutal, and his direction to them is follow your instincts, just act natural. And they have this conversation.
Have fun.
Have fun. Torture people. And the Vietnamese object to that, and they're like, no, we're going to act like assholes. We're going to act evil, but we're going to do a good job of it. We're not going to have fun. We're going to act. And so they're able to give the director the performance he wants, but not through the means that he assumes. I guess he's being a little bit racist, right? He assumes or maybe he's being just cynical in general, that everybody enjoys torturing their enemies, and instead, these are South Vietnamese patriots. So instead, what they're doing is acting the way that they perceive their enemies as behaving, which is probably also. They're also being a little bit chauvinistic in their own way, but there's so many interesting layers of what's happening in that moment. I also really liked that.
Oh my God, it was so great. And I think that's what creating this character who has sympathies for everyone allows Nguyen to do. It allows him to point out all of the complexities of conflict and capitalism versus communism. I mean, this book tackles very, very big ideas that have shaped our world's history over the past century, but still manages to make it a compelling psychological drama about one character, which I think is really impressive. And I think that's what the choice of being sympathetic to basically everyone gets the author.
And do you think, and this is maybe a rhetorical question because I have an answer to this, but do you think it loses you anything along with gaining something?
Probably, because anytime you make a big choice when you're writing or creating, that inevitably loses you other choices. Right. I don't quite, okay, you say that you have an answer to that. Would you tell me your answer, and I will see if that sort of jogs, because it's a big question. I'll see if that kind of jogs my thoughts about what I feel.
Well, I'll say for me what it does is I find myself a little bit less invested in the actual plot, in the action. That in terms of then the novel pulling me along or not, I actually don't find it necessarily pulls me along in the sense that I'm really looking forward to reading it. Instead, it's sort of like, well, I've made the decision to read it, and while I'm reading it, I appreciate it. But to me, the narrators, I think there's two things going on too. Partly it's because he's a sympathizer, but I also think because of his particular voice, which is kind of ironic and poetic, both of those things combine to kind of detach me from the stakes of the action a little bit, and such that I found that I didn't really care very much about what was happening until the narrator is asked to kill the crapulent major, because in that moment it's just a terrible thing that he's being asked to do, and he knows it's a terrible thing, and we know why he's doing it. We can kind of sympathize with why he's doing it, and it's war. Yeah. And he sees himself as a spy and with a certain set of responsibilities. So it's no less ethical than any other act of, wartime espionage, assassination. All of that stuff is terrible. But he's asked to do it. And I think when all of these, he's observing other people's moral failings. He's observing people in these different relationships to one another. He's a little bit wry. He's a little bit humorous. But in this moment, he's got to literally put not his money, but his lead where his mouth is. And that's when it gets interesting to me. Yeah. But I do think that what it loses you when you have a character who sympathizes with everybody is that maybe it's a little harder to get invested in the action in the plot then. I think bad guys do create a kind of drive, and if there aren't any bad guys, it can be harder to find the stakes of the story.
Yeah, and I think Nguyen has a pretty effective fix for what you're describing, because my experience of the first 3 chapters was like, I am enjoying this voice. I like this kind of like discursive, thoughtful, looping kind of thing. But the first few chapters, you're just like, okay, yeah, I don't really know what's happening here. And then you get the evacuation from Saigon, which like this book that you've been reading, which up until that point sort of feels like we're just placing chess pieces on a board.
Yeah, with like occasional flashbacks where he'll just sort of be like, "Oh yeah, and I spent a wonderful 6 years at Occidental College as an undergrad, reading Emerson and looking at the legs of the nubile young women, and da 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 da, and then and then I wiled my way down to the lieutenant's house, who I had to bribe, and he didn't really want to be bribed, but he needed the money, so he took it, and da 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 da. That's happening, and suddenly we're at the airport, and bombs are going off,
you're
and
like,
people are
holy
blowing
shit.
up, and children are dying, and
like people are getting shot and planes are blowing up, and it's one of those things where it's a good lesson, everybody. A little action is a real like, it's like seasoning, especially in a novel like this that is ostensibly not a very actionful book.
Right.
And I think because like in that moment, even though the narrator kind of cares about too many people, there is a very clear bad guy, and it is the people that are trying to blow up the plane. And even then,
the communists.
Maybe the communists, because there's even an idea floated that it's the South Vietnamese who are attacking these planes because they're running.
Maybe so.
And so
maybe
even then we get another little like, maybe it's this, maybe it's not. But the action writing is really good. Like it is like brisk and clear, and I have a very good picture of what's going on and how uncomfortable the plane is with like hundreds of people kind of packed in, and like I think I wouldn't have minded if we got there.
Could have been the first
a little
first
sooner,
page, right? Like that could have been the first page. Well, I mean, you and I said the same thing about Parable of the Sower, right? I mean, I think both of us really admire that book, but I think I really found myself kind of snapping to and paying attention when she has to kill that dog.
Yeah.
And some of the abstracted moral, ethical, philosophical questions that she was pondering up to that point suddenly snap into reality, and action has to be taken. And same thing here. And I don't know, maybe that means we're bad people, and like, we just need some death and like terrible things to happen, or we're not like we're Roman empires. Like, show us more blood. This is boring. It's just words. But I think it's, hopefully it's not that, and it's more that the stakes of this story suddenly snap into place in a way that they're just being played with up to that point. And I agree that part was horrific. And I do think though that in the end, the novel works pretty well because this character is in a really impossible situation. Kind of his own making, but also kind of the world's making, and it's certainly worth exploring, and there's plenty of turmoil and conflict and drama to be had in this situation. It just takes a little bit of, takes a few too, I agree with you. I think it takes a few too many chapters to get to it.
So if we kind of agree on that, it kind of leads into my next question. And you've brought up the epistolary nature of the novel so far. So let's imagine a novel where, like you just said, the attack on the airport is really the first page and we begin in media res. And we would probably have to lose the framing of the novel as an epistle. I mean, maybe there's a different way we can do it. But what would we lose if we lost sight of the fact that this is a piece of writing that's being written in a jail cell, and we don't even really know? We can make some guesses as to who he has been jailed by. Yeah. But we're not totally sure. I mean, Commandant is not Comrade. So
Yeah. You know, I mean, I assume that he has been jailed by his own side for some reason or another. I don't know why that would be. But I think for a couple reasons, and one is that he's often more at pains to defend the South Vietnamese than his side. And often the moments where he is most explicitly addressing the reader, the commandant, are those moments where he's defending, almost as if to say, like, I hear you saying that there's no way the general could have actually been kind and sincere in this moment, but I think he was. You know, he's kind of there are a couple moments like that where he's making that argument. And I don't know, to me with the letter framing, it gets two things that I can point to. One is it just reinforces the idea of the sympathizer, because I think he does find himself defending these people who I assume the commandant thinks are supposed to be the enemy. And I think, you know, that presents a kind of vacuum into which our narrator feels like he has to tell us what's good about the general or what's good about the auteur, in a way that just heightens that sense of a lack of judgment, which I think is one of the themes, not even just a theme of the novel. It's almost like the concept of the novel. Like, what if there's a novel in which everybody's a good guy, sort of is kind of like the thought process. The other thing I think it gets you is an explanation of the voice, and also of the kind of ironic detachment that the voice takes on from time to time. And maybe even the confessional quality, because otherwise, you know, if this were written in third person, you know, close third person, limited third person, you would have to lose the voice. And this guy is kind of funny. And he's kind
so
of
funny.
He's funny, and he's observing ironies, humorously and with a kind of detachment. I mean, the fact that he just can't help himself but refer to this character as the crapulent major every time is so... It's interesting. And also, I think it's character building because it kind of speaks to his guilt a little bit too. Like, there's something about, like, he can't quite bring himself to constantly grapple with the enormity of what he's done to this person. So giving him kind of a comical nickname assuages that a little bit, I think. So I think it's an explanation for the voice. And, you know, my theory would be that this voice comes very naturally to the writer, you know, to Viet Nguyen, and that to some degree there's an attraction. Part of probably what attracted the writer to this story is the opportunity to write and explore this voice. And you need a vehicle in which to do that. And epistolary novel is a great vehicle in which to do that, because it explicitly is the voice of the character.
I've got a section, this may lead into your Squid question, but I do have a little parenthetical that I think kind of nails the voice that you're talking about. And since it also involves animals that are sometimes eaten, perhaps it's a good entree into your next question.
As it were, a amuse-bouche.
So this is a section where the narrator is kind of tracking the discomfiture that Americans have with Vietnamese that have moved to the United States after the war. It's really redolent of that section of The Sellout when the narrator is talking about the difference between closure and erasure. That really what the Americans, in this case, similar to The Sellout, just don't want the Vietnamese there.
Right. If I remember correctly, it's also redolent of fermented fish paste as well.
Totally.
Which is a flavor I find delicious.
Me too. But it does have a assertive smell.
It asserts itself. It introduces itself to the room, for sure.
Yeah. That's one that you probably wouldn't use the passive voice for. So, we were strange aliens rumored to have a predilection for Fido americanus, the domestic canine on whom was lavished more per capita than the annual income of a starving Bangladeshi family. The true horror of this situation was actually beyond the ken of the average American. While some of us indeed have been known to sup on the brethren of Rin Tin Tin and Lassie, we did not do so in the Neanderthal-esque way imagined by the average American, with a club, a roast, and some salt, but with a gourmand's depth of ingenuity and creativity, our chefs able to cook canids 7 different virility-enhancing ways, from extracting the marrow to grilling and boiling, as well as sausage making, stewing, and a few varieties of frying and steaming. Yum.
Yeah, he's rubbing our noses in it.
Sure is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the and I think you're right that that's what the epistolary gets us. Is it gets us the ability to engage in those flights of fancy. I think one of the things that I really admire about this book is the way that he takes structure and allows that to inform character and voice.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I also, it's interesting too how often what ends up being kind of important plot insights start as kind of like digressions in a scene in which the narrator is describing something else. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I think Bastard. So the moment where I can't remember if I'm exactly right about this, but if I remember correctly, the moment where we kind of first learn that he is biracial and that his father was French is shortly after he and his friends get into an almost altercation with some Marine lieutenants back in Saigon who refer to him as a bastard. Yeah. And then he has this moment where he says, the word itself didn't bother me as much as my reaction to it. And then he goes on this kind of long meandering, and we actually learn something very important about his history and his backstory. Yeah. But it comes, the way it's written, it almost feels like he's just kind of doing a little like guitar noodle, like what you were just doing with all the different ways of cooking canids, or Fido and Rin Tin Tin's cousin, but then it turns out to be important plot. And I think one of the things that's really masterful about this book is the way in which digression and plot intersect constantly. Yeah, and to the degree in which it also kind of keeps you on your toes because you never know what's going to be important. Little details where you just think, oh, he's doing a little bit of a flourish, actually prove really important to the plot in certain interesting ways. I also think, my sense of the character with this voice and his sense of humor, his kind of anger, he's angry at the way Vietnamese are portrayed by Americans or thought of by Americans, but he's also angry at his own culture. Yeah. Too, he's willing to satirize his own culture, and he kind of, this guy's life is not very good. Yeah. It's really kind of a rough life. And the sort of one pleasure and maybe the way that he kind of gets through is by kind of satirizing everything he encounters. Yeah. And so I think that's another not necessarily advantage of the epistle or the epistolary novel, but a advantage of being in the first person is you can kind of hear him, a kind of protective armor of irony that he's constantly spinning around himself.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think it is like a defense mechanism for somebody who is in a real bind.
Yeah.
Like he is.
Terrible bind.
Yeah. He really has. And it's kind of, it's one of those things where you're like, is this narrator reliable? Is all of the ironizing simply covering up a real desperation, kind of like what you're talking about? And that's possible. And I like that it's possible. And it could be other things too. I think that, like you said, the ability for digression to become plot. There's this moment when the narrator talks about the Vietnamese quality of maybe suspicion coupled with the American tendency towards paranoia. Yeah. And it's one of those where you begin wondering if each digression, you're like, where's this going to go? And maybe that's why you're wondering about the squid.
Indeed. I'm trying to figure out how to frame this as a question because I'm afraid it's going to be a little bit of a rhetorical question. But What does this squid raping get us?
I don't. I sort of, early on, we exchanged a very funny text where you said something like, "Things really picked up for me, once we get to the real moral quandary of the book, with an exception for a very confusing moment of like oceanic bestiality."
I think what it was is like I just had to get past the non-consensual necrophilic onanistic bestiality.
Yeah, that was it. Much better phrase. I was casting around in my brain for what you had said. I had not gotten to that moment in the book yet, and I was like, "What the fuck?"
That must have been a very confusing text.
Well, I mean,
dear reader or listener, if you have not read the book, let's just say the narrator shares memories very similar to Philip Roth in Portnoy's complaint of essentially using squid as a sex toy, a squid that his mother has purchased and is preparing to cook for the family meal, and then feeling guilty about it, and so then both cleaning the squid and then sort of arranging so that he eats the defiled squid, so that nobody in his family is forced to eat the squid that he is defiled. And it's presented as a kind of moral foible, somewhat apologetically, although he does point out, that the squids were dead already, which is true. And I don't know. I mean, it's just like it feels like it's a theme now, right? Because, you were talking about Blue Angel, the Francine prose novel, and you read us a scene with a dead chicken raping, and then I mentioned Portnoy's complaint earlier, and we had the crayfish in Tampopo, or was it? No, it wasn't. It was a prawn or a shrimp in Tampopo, and then there's American Pie, and it's just like, if you believe the writers of the world, like no animal ingredient on earth is safe from the penises of the world's teenage boys. Like eventually everything is going to be tried on as a sort of, stand-in for the vagina at some point or another. And it seems like a high percentage of writers feel the need to put these moments into their novel and or movie or whatever. And I don't fully understand why.
So I would argue that it is less about the actual I think he actually says deflowering of the shrimp.
Deflowering or defiling, both would be fine. I mean, both would be accurate. I
think it's less about that and more about the fact I was very surprised when the narrator chooses to eat the squid in question when it is served dinner. He sort of comes up with a scenario. He sort of crosshatches the squid so that he will be able to identify it when it is cooked. And
which is an act of kindness, right? He's sparing his other family members from eating the defiled squid.
And I think, so we know that this character is basically abused.
I think I know where you're going here. Yeah, no, I think this is a good point.
Yeah, it's not fully formed, so I wonder if I'm going to get there or not. I think it is something to do with guilt and shame and feeling like that he needs to kind of fix everything.
It's kind of like giving the widow of the crapulent major half of his, settlement money.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very complicated, pretty fucked up guy. Who Nguyen really manages to make us sympathize with him. Because he is winsome and clever and wry, and his voice is fun to engage with. And we find out these little moments of his childhood that are just horrid. His cousins that say some very terrible things to him. His aunt who kind of basically is like, I'm not going to give you a gift because of something that was completely out of your control. It is pretty bullshit anyway. And that there is this high degree of abuse that the narrator has experienced. And what I think is impressive is that Nguyen doesn't allow that to become the sort, there's this real tendency in movies and books and things like that to be like, well, the reason that your narrator is the way they are is because of trauma. And I think that he manages to explain this moment with the squid through thinking about who the character is. But what becomes important is the character's reaction to the situation. And I think in a way that we see the rest of his character developing in the rest of the book, which is to continue to involve himself in trying to fix situations that he should not be trying to fix.
This is terrible. I mean, I think you just justified the squid right there. I can't. I just saw it as just like one of the everything you said makes, to me it was just one of those like digressions that the writer just can't help himself, which Paul Beatty's novel is full of. We've talked about David Foster Wallace's penchant. Yeah. It's just like, I'm gonna just have an Irish guy talking about the first time I had a solid turd, by God, just because that's fun. And, I just thought it was a version of a particularly messed up, version of that. Maybe showing off for the other literary writers, like, oh, Francine prose. You think you're clever with your chicken. Well, you ever notice the shape of a squid's body before? Think I can one up you,
We should put together some sort of like irreverent, tile of like great moments in authorial bestiality.
Authorial bestiality or proxy vaginas of the world, American. I've never seen American Pie, but I assume that the reason it's called American Pie is because there is a pie rogering at some point in that film. If I remember, I mean, I feel like I've absorbed that through, like the previews and
I think actually osmosis. To defend American Pie at the moment is that in a moment of
at least the pie was never alive,
right?
I mean,
in a moment of kind of like we've talked about lampshading before or hand waving.
Yeah,
we American Pie at least has the taste. To let us know what's happened through a scene that happens after the pie violation, which is very funny with the main character and his father kind of just looking at the pie together. And,
is that Eugene Levy?
Yeah, and Eugene Levy does some marvelous quip, and I'm not going to be able to remember what it is.
Something like we've all been 16 once or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, or like, maybe if we smooth it out, your mother won't notice. Something like that. Great moments in horrible advice from your father.
Right. I haven't seen the movie, but if I remember, doesn't the father sort of show a bit of humanity in helping the son hide the evidence?
Yes.
Or absorbing responsibility, saying, like, oh, I ran over the pie with my car. I'm so silly, or something like that.
It's something like that. It's been a long time since I've seen it. Yeah. And weirdly, this is the second time in a week that I've talked with someone about American Pie. So who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
We should probably get a move on a little bit.
Maybe we can leave it at that. I mean, I did have my one reading.
Do your reading. I already got a reading out, and if we picked the same one, I'll be very interested.
Okay.
But
all right, and then we can go to trivia, I guess. So here's a reading. Maybe it's the same one that you had. This is Bon is the name of his friend who also evacuates Saigon, loses his wife and young son in the attack on the airport. Really, really sad. And Bon has been assigned to help the narrator assassinate, kill the crapulent major. And Bon is actually really excited about this. And maybe you pulled something from a little bit earlier, but he tells this story about the birth of his son and how meaningful that was to him. And of course, he lost his son in an earlier scene. So he, after telling the story and basically saying, how meaningful the birth of his son was, he then says to the narrator, "What I'm saying, why I'm telling you all of this, is that my life once had meaning. It once had purpose. Now it has none. I was a son, and a husband and a father and a soldier, and now I'm none of that. I'm not a man. And when a man isn't a man, he's nobody. And the only way not to be nobody is to do something. So I can either kill myself or someone else. Get it? I not only got it, I was astonished. It was the longest speech I'd ever heard from him, his sorrow and rage and despair not only cracking open his heart, but loosening his vocal cords. Those words even succeeded in making him less ugly than he objectively was, if not handsome, emotion softening the hard features of his face. He was the only man I had ever met who seemed moved deeply, not only by love, but also by the prospect of killing. Well, he was an expert by necessity. I was a novice by choice, despite having had my opportunities. In our country, killing a man or woman or child was as easy as turning a page of the morning paper. One only needed an excuse and an instrument, and too many on all sides possessed both. What I did not have was the desire or the various uniforms of justification a man dons as camouflage, the need to defend God, country, honor, ideology, or comrades. Even if in the last instance all he really is protecting is that most tender part of himself, the hidden, wrinkled purse carried by every man. These off-the-rack excuses fit some people well, but not me.
Just a fucking amazing paragraph of writing.
It is. I think it's the thesis of the book.
I think you're right. Yeah.
You know, I think,
totally.
and also that it starts from something so specific. You know, Bond's loss, Bond explaining to his friend, you know, our narrator, why he is excited about doing something terrible, about murdering somebody, about how that makes complete sense, and then where it takes our narrator and how he is both able to completely sympathize with Bond's point of view, see it as honest, and then also recognize the ways in which people justify terrible things that they do, and then also declare his inability to do that, all in a sort of, and in the most kind of poetic and insightful writing that you can imagine.
Yeah,
is this the same passage you
absolutely
marked as well?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Like it felt like the heart of, if not the novel, then at least the first half of it. And what I think I'm sort of saying the same thing you're saying. This novel is very similar to being in a very complicated storm.
Yeah.
There's so much going on. There's so many different ways that we can think about it. There are a lot of characters. There is a lot of nuance. And the characters are sort of doubled, and he's a spy and he's a sympathizer. And there's all this noise. And in this paragraph, it's like the noise lifts off.
Yeah.
And the cover is off, and you are simply looking into this like horrible void of what it means to be human and to have gone through something absolutely terrible. And I sat up in my chair while I was reading it and was just like, oh my goodness. And it's great because like, I think part of this novel's attraction is the way that it casts a spell on you. Yeah. And there is a lot of misdirection, and there is a lot of like, look over here and look over here. And then he pulls all of that away from us and is like, look into the depth of this person's suffering, and the ways that we justify the terrible, terrible things that we do to one another. I was just completely blown away by it.
I think the other thing I'm realizing reading this passage too is another virtue of having empathy for nearly all the characters, which is that in doing so, you can give them their reasons for doing things, and those reasons can make complete sense, but he does not let them off the hook, nor does he let himself off the hook one bit. Yeah. So the awfulness of what they do is not mitigated in any particular way. It just is what it is. And so in being empathetic, you actually can see people clearly, and therefore you can see the moral horror of what these people choose to do, but choose to do because they've been put into absolutely horrible, unwinnable circumstances, through the machinations of colonialism and war. And I think that you see that movement right here, where it goes from empathy to, at the same time, absolute dismissal of the rationales of the warrior, of the spy, of the politician, of the communist, of the not exactly capitalist, but whatever, the patriotic South Vietnamese, all of those become meaningless. And everybody who's doing something terrible the way they're about to do, they're doing it for reasons very similar to Bond.
Yeah.
They just want to feel whole again.
Yeah. That was great, man. You nailed it. That was good.
Trivia?
Let's go to trivia. Way to go. That was incredible. All right. So Viet Thanh Nguyen, our author. We totally forgot to say this is the 2016 novel by Viet Thanh Nguyen that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2016, I believe. Okay. In an interview with the New York Times, the interlocutor asked him which writer he would invite to dinner.
Oh, interesting.
Was it A, Haruki Murakami, B, Carrie Fisher? I will also say that in this particular article, Star Wars is mentioned twice. That's not a hint, but just contextualizing that, Carrie Fisher is not a wild choice here.
Yep.
John Berger, or D, all of the above.
Oh, man. I don't think I know who John Berger is, but you don't have to tell me. Interesting, I watched Star Wars 1977 last night, so Carrie Fisher is very much on my brain. Carrie Fisher is an excellent writer, and her voice is actually quite similar to Viet Thanh Nguyen. The kind of neurotic, first-person, flawed, but seeing one's own flaws and the flaws of others through a kind of ironic detachment, and humorous. I'm going to say D, all of the above.
You're correct. Yes. John Berger, English writer, 1972 novel G won the Booker Prize. And
I've heard of that.
Yes. So he said, Haruki Murakami, since it seems unlikely I'll ever meet him, which I don't understand that, but I don't know.
All he has to do is sign up for the New York Marathon, right?
Apparently.
Doesn't Murakami run the New York Marathon every year or something like that?
He's a big marathoner, for sure. He's that great book, what we talk about when we talk about running, is a good book about running, and probably one of the better books about running out there. So here's the whole thing. Haruki Murakami, since it seems unlikely I'll ever meet him, he can curate the music and cook spaghetti. Carrie Fisher,
pick out the bourbon too,
for her wit and bravura. Lastly, John Berger. I love that Berger gave half his Booker Prize money in 1972 to the Black Panthers and used the other half to fund the research for his next book on migrant laborers. Berger was the kind of writer we need more of. Politically committed, aesthetically serious, always curious.
Okay, trivia for you, also writerly. The Sympathizer is loosely inspired by the life of Pham Xuan An. I hope I say that right. Pham Xuan An, who was a spy for North Vietnam, who was also a reporter for several U.S. publications, including Reuters and Time. And it's a loose inspiration. The character is a different biography, but there are elements that they have in common. So An was close friends with several American writers, including this famous American writer who only learned that An was a spy for the North Vietnamese after he died. Was the writer An was close friends with Norman Mailer, A, B, David Halberstam, C, Joan Didion, or D, Larry Niven? Keep in mind, it was the 70s.
Yep. Yeah, so it's possible. So
Larry
Niven
was
is
very
possible.
Interested in Vietnam.
Boy, now I'm just imagining the moment of you doing some research on this and being like, oh my God, it's Larry Niven. like what?
I'm waiting for that moment.
That like moment of synchronicity where Larry Niven organically shows up in our trivia. And I'm just going to be like, it's not D.
It's all a long con for that one time that it's actually Larry Niven.
I'm getting a warm feeling on, let's see.
Do you need to hear him again?
No, I got it. I got Mailer, Halberstam, and Didion. This is unflattering to Mailer, but I am going to go with Mailer because I think it's the kind of thing where it makes sense that he would have missed the details about somebody else.
I agree with you, but it was B, David Halberstam.
Damn it!
And I don't, David Halberstam, known for baseball writing, known for writing about Nixon, but also was a Vietnam War correspondent.
One of the great,
spent a lot of time there.
Vietnam War correspondent. It's a bummer because I know that about Halberstam, and yet my brain is more fixated on the Red Sox and then his book about rowing, which I think is one of the best sports. It's the only piece of writing that I have read where I'm like, yes, that is exactly what it's like when you were sitting on the start line, knowing that you were about to be in agony for a long time. It's an amazing book. Everybody read it. The Amateurs.
I'm trying to imagine. Does anybody born in our generation get to have that kind of career anymore? Where it's like, you'll write like books about the major war of your generation and like the presidency, and baseball, and rowing.
I wonder. That's a great question. Do any of us get to, or is everybody doing that now? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, also that generation is, Bob Woodward is still writing books about the White House. It's sort of like, get in line, the 70s generation. Hendrik Hertzberg is still, breaking news. So many of the great reporters of the 70s are still going strong, fortunately.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that just the opportunities for being an eclectic writer and making a living at that. I mean, sure, you and I could write about anything we want on our Substack. The 250 people read if we're lucky.
Will it get noticed?
Or could you make a living? Exactly.
My friend Steve, who I was talking to earlier today, is sort of a new friend, and I sent him the direction of our show. And I was like, thank you for listening. You were 3% now of our readership. Excellent.
Yeah. Well,
we'll get there.
I sometimes feel like what we're doing is we're kind of like filling up the steam of the boiler room.
Yeah.
So even though I feel like a lot of our episodes get like a certain number of downloads and it doesn't seem like it's getting to be that much, I'm wondering if sometimes they're different people. And so like we're gathering a large potential audience and kind of like latent heat building up. Eventually it's going to affect a state change.
I think you're right.
Or the locomotive is going to
I 100% believe. But everybody that's listening, you can help us. Please. Yeah. Share the podcast. Tell a friend. Let people know that you enjoy what it is that we are doing. And JPD, what are we doing next?
Coming up next, we are going to get to the second half of this book. But first, a digression episode with Jason Herbert from the Historians at the Movie podcast. And we're going to talk about our favorite baseball movies. And that's going to come out on opening day, March 28th.
Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the generals in exile. Music is by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes, and design and website by me, Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us and find our listener survey at uppermiddlebrow.com. And please review us in your podcast app so other people can find the show, or tell a friend.
And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors, and we can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, the creatively titled chrisbag.com and jessedukes.com.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.